Have the recorder on yet. Wait a minute, here we go. Okay. All right.
All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, my friends and family. It is a pleasure to greet you again this evening, and to be in the fourth year of the forum now is rather a remarkable milestone as far as I'm concerned. And the fact that every Monday night we've been having these gatherings, and so often we talk about Zion. Tony Crandall this evening points out that he wants to be there anytime we're talking about Zion. This evening, clearly, that's one of those opportunities that he's on, and we have the privilege of hearing from James Lucas. And I didn't have a picture of James Lucas without also the picture of Jonathan Neville. And so, since they presented together last time, then I used that picture anyway. I do want to give you an update because for the last couple of weeks, I've asked for you to pray for Abigail Barnes, the young lady who was hit by a truck in a car accident on Highway 34 in Iowa. She was the sole survivor of the four girls in the truck in the car. She's been in a coma for the last month. They've moved her from Methodist Hospital in Des Moines to the Lincoln Madonna Rehabilitation Center in Lincoln, Nebraska. I went there to see her on last Wednesday and had the privilege of introducing Greg Christ. That's spelled Christ. So I had no particular difficulty in selecting who would be the minister that I would call upon to meet me there and try to get acquainted with the Barnes family, because anybody with a name like Christ clearly has to be a minister. So that was an easy call. He and his wife met me at the hospital, and they're such sweet, generous people. They invited the Barneses to take shelter in their basement apartment and be able to shower and wash clothes and rest and reprieve. But just so neat to be able to tie another prayerful, faithful pastor into the network. I haven't checked today, but the last I checked, we were over 55,000 people on Caring Bridge praying for and uniting their faith in Abby's behalf. But last Wednesday, when I got there, I walked into room A19 and she was sitting up and she was eating sushi, being fed by the nurse. I waved at her and called her by name. She looked up, waved at me, and said, "Hi, Paul." It was such a blessing to have her recognize me. And so I went and gave her a hug, and she reminded me that she had planted trees on our farm. She remembered that she is involved in the Sesquicentennial Project, writing the history of the families that have been in Lamoni for more than 100 years. She then got up and ran around the room, and the nurse had to chase after her. There was a handle on the backside because her left side is still impaired. Her left eye was impaired. And the nurse was trying to make sure that she didn't run into something and get hurt. But then she came back and sat down and reflected that the Sesquicentennial Project would have to wait because she needed to finish her senior project at Graceland. And then she said, "I want to get started on my master's degree." What an awesome experience to see this lady after a month. And the doctor said after a month, the chances of coming out of the coma and being normal are so marginal. But here the miracle is happening. And the round the world network of faith and prayer has been working. And I want to thank you all for joining in that, because it's just an amazing thing when we lay before the Christ our concerns, our faith, our needs for his children, and see such remarkable things as this happen. And so I praise the Lord, and I want to share that with you. And Deb was pointing out that we received a message from her father today. To Deb, help me out. Would you tell people what Travis had to say today?
Yes, he said that she was going to be seen at the Madonna. They were going to do some testing. She gets her first report from the Madonna today, and he requested prayers. That was first thing in the morning, and then he wrote back on my lunch that she wrote a complete sentence today on her own, and she was able to read. So they're thanking us for continued prayers. So every little step is a step forward.
So marvelous. Learning to read again and to write. What an awesome blessing. Well, we are blessed this evening to have James Lucas as our presenter, and he's going to be talking about Zion in 3rd Nephi with special emphasis upon economic and political issues. And so I'm confident it's going to be a fun presentation and discussion. We've had him presenting previous times, several times, and so we can count on we come to count on these old timers that keep coming back with new information. Brother Lucas is an attorney in New York, a regular participant and presenter on the forum, co-author with Varner Woodworth of the Working Toward Zion book, which is Principles of the United Order for the Modern World, and still negotiating to get that report on that book when Brother Woodruff can be available. But tonight, we gain an update as James shares Zionic aspects of the Book of Mormon and 3rd Nephi with Mormon's economic, social, and political analysis. I suspect most of us haven't bothered to take a look at the social, political, and economic analyses that Mormon has done in 3rd Nephi, so I think you'll find this to be a unique experience. His most recent presentation on April 24 with Jonathan Neville was on the Urim and Thummim, and that will be remembered as one of the more comprehensive that we received on that topic to date. And so we welcome Jim back to the forum. Let us pray. Father of Zion, of the universe, of the Prince of Peace, we bow seeking instruction, your presence that our insight increase. We're asking that your Spirit guide our presenter, Brother James Lucas, and our participants in our quest to actively engage Zion as prospective cultural transplants. We recognize our cultural heritage is dysfunctional in themes of empire, crime, and war. And we want to embrace the themes of virtue, equity, and peace to embody forevermore. Yet a chasm appears between where we are and the image we have from above, wherein poverty is wiped out and people live in love. And so we seek to open eyes and ears to life as it could be when we adopt your principles preparing us for eternity. We find we need your help as we seek to let contention cease and embrace compassionate Zion as we learn to live in peace. We pray in the name of Christ, your Son, whom we rely on. Amen. Brother Lucas, the floor is yours.
There we go. Now let's see if I can make this work.
Oh, let me interrupt by pointing out that next week we have not filled the gap, but the plan for next week is for Mike Riggs and Paul DeBarth to share the Hans Miller Hamlet. The book hopefully will be out by then, and so we'll hope. But if it isn't, we'll use the resources that we have to present anyway. But that's one that's been delayed 3 times now, and so we intend to proceed with it. All right, thank you, James. Proceed.
Okay, now just 1 second. There we go. Hopefully I can make this work. Okay, so this is a presentation derived from actually a Sunday school lesson, which I presented in 2020 when in the LDS Church we were studying the Book of Mormon. And but it has been, I've tried to update it and adapt it some. And I also hope to kind of get an interesting different take from this group on this presentation. I also have tried to go through here and provide the Community of Christ chapter and verses, as well as the LDS chapters and verses. So as I go through here, you'll see the scripture designations, and then there'll be numbers in brackets. So the numbers in brackets are the Community of Christ versions, to the extent that I could adapt them. Okay. Let's see. So in any event, so the actual range of the our discussion is going to cover the end of the book of 3 Nephi and then all of the book of 4 Nephi. So we kind of start, and this is partly an artifact of the fact that that was how the LDS lesson manual is divided up, but it also happens to be kind of how the subject falls out as far as how Mormon organized this kind of particular subject or presentation of a particular time period in his book. So that's his. So we're doing 4 Nephi, which is the same in both of the versions of the Book of Mormon, but we're going to start out here first at 3 Nephi, which is chapter 27 in the LDS version and 12 in the Community of Christ version. Now, what I'm presenting here is in part based on a book that I wrote about 20 years ago with Warner Woodworth called Working Towards Zion, Principles of the United Order for the Modern World. Now, this is not a presentation on that book, as Paul alluded to. He's after me, and I'm after my co-author to come and present to you all about this book. But nonetheless, just so that you have a reference for some of the ideas that I'm presenting in this presentation, this is sort of the foundation of the research that led me to be able to put this presentation together. And I might note, just for your interest, that my co-author, Warner Woodworth, has done a more recent book called Radiant Mormonism, where he updates the practicum of the Working Towards Zion book. The Working Towards Zion book was sort of, the first half was sort of scripture, history, and theory, and then the second half was practicum, all many different ways of applying principles of Zion in the modern world. And so just a few years ago, my Warner published another book where he brought forward his experience in the last 20 years in applying that. And Warner's one of the world's leading experts in microenterprise and NGOs. So it's full of all kinds of very interesting examples of the practical side of the kinds of concepts that I'll be talking about today. So since we are touching on political matters, and at least in the LDS Church, institutionally, there's real hypersensitivity toward touching the issue of political matters. We started off with this statement on political engagement, where the leadership of the LDS Church was advocating that everybody should live the gospel and demonstrate Christ-like love and civility in political discourse. So I just note that, although it comes from the LDS Church presidency, I believe that's a sentiment that we all can support. And it's one that will, I hope, inform the discussion this evening. So let's get to the Book of Mormon. Now, the first thing that's interesting to me is that in the period in 3 Nephi, after the period of Christ's visit, this is often, I think, overlooked, although you folks all might be very familiar with it. Even though Christ had visited and there were all sorts of thunders and storms and miraculous things that happened to the people when Christ appeared to them in the land bountiful, nonetheless, according to Mormon's account, this did not result in a universal conversion. And I think that's just an interesting point to keep in mind as we go through Mormon's account here. And in fact, these verses, and as I say, the Community of Christ versification is in brackets, and the LDS versification is in front of it. And he notes that there people who went out to preach. The 12 disciples and the other converts from Christ's visit who went out to preach were persecuted for quite some time. And so this kind of describes some of what they were suffered. And it was really not, it took several years for enough people to be converted for a Zion society to be created. So, and I think that that's kind of useful to keep in mind when we think about, creating a more Zionic society, even with the coming of Christ and miracles and all kinds of dramatic events, even that does not convert the hearts of men, but rather preaching converts the hearts of men to have them follow Christ-like lives and try to build a Christ-like society. So it says, in this verse here that in the 36th year, so the coming, I believe, was in the 33rd year. So it took several years for enough of the society to be people to be converted that you began to get to this idyllic society that's described. And but eventually did reach a point where there were no contentions and disputations among them, and every man did deal justly one with another. And so Mormon then gives us in 4 Nephi this description of this Zion society. And it really is, to my knowledge, other than the brief reference to the city of Enoch, which appears in the LDS Pearl of Great Price and in the Revised Bible as published by the Community of Christ. But that's a very short description, really. So this is really, to my knowledge, the longest description in Scripture of a true Zion society. So you're probably familiar with it. They had all things in common among them. There were no poor, rich or poor, bond or free, but all were made free and partakers of the heavenly gift. There was no contention in the land because God did dwell in the hearts of the people. No envyings, no strifes, no tumults, whoredoms, lying, murders. So this is a crime-free society because there are no robbers, murderers, neither. And this is a part I think that a lot of people note. Neither were there Lamanites or any manner of ites. I don't know, that's just a phrase that always struck with me, and I seem to be a lot of people that phrase, there were no manner of ites, strikes us. And how blessed were they, for the Lord did bless them in all their endeavors, and they prospered for 110 years. For the first generation passed away, and there was no contention in the land. So we have this picture of a Zion society in the Scriptures, the longest description that I'm aware of. So how did this come about? So we went and cite that we have from Joseph Smith. Now, this is actually not a direct quote. It comes through John Taylor. I've spent a long time, and other people have spent a long time, trying to find a primary source for this quote, and there simply is none. But John Taylor was a close associate, of Joseph Smith. He was one of the apostles, and a man who was very interested in political matters. So he would be keen to listen to Joseph's thoughts on political matters. And of course, he's the source of this famous expression when someone asked Joseph how he's able to govern these people. And Mr. Smith remarked it was very easy. And how responded the gentleman? To us, it is very difficult. And he replied, I teach them correct principles and they govern themselves. So that's sort of a very well-known expression of Joseph's approach. And it relates well with what Mormon wrote in 4 Nephi, where he emphasized that the reason that this idyllic society was created was because the hearts of the people were devoted to these Christian and Zionic principles. Okay, so now let's get to kind of the point I'd like to get to, or let's jump up and apply this to our times. So first question is, does Mormons work directly address the specific political disputes of our times? So this is a little table that shows an estimate of the total value of the wealth of the world over time. And if you notice, this has a very interesting slope in that basically for most of human history, their estimate of the wealth of humanity was pretty flat. So in other words, it only takes a sharp uptick around 1870. And of course, that's when the Industrial Revolution happens. So if you go back here to about, 200 or 300 or 300 or 400 BC, when Mormon is alive, you see that this is still a time when the overall wealth of humanity is pretty flat, as it had been for millennia before him, and as it was to continue to be for a millennia after Mormon. This is so the question, we have this question: how does what Mormon talks about in the Book of Mormon relate to our modern society when the economics of the society he lived in was so different than our own economics, where you had a relatively flat and not very rapidly increasing wealth of humanity, which was, of course, the state of humanity for most of history. And to note that this change was very noticed by in our modern times, was noticed by everyone. I have these two great quotes. Now, this is a bit amusing. When I presented this as a Sunday school lesson, my Sunday school president, who was very favorable to my kind of a little bit idiosyncratic look at the Book of Mormon, nonetheless was a little shaken about the idea of having quotes from Karl Marx in his Sunday school lesson. But nonetheless, I think these two are very much on point, where Marx observes that it's the big industry and the endless expansion of production which makes it possible for there to be his socialist society. And he predicts that, again, big industry. Our idealists often overlook the fact that Marx and early Marxists were big fans of big industry, and that reflected itself on the voraciousness with which the Soviet Union and Communist China embraced industrialization. But he said this is what makes it possible to make the development of society sufficient products to satisfy the needs of everyone. So now let's go to Mormon's economic analysis, and then we'll come back to this. So Mormon, of course, is in these parts of the Book of Mormon, and indeed throughout his Book of Mormon, basically, Mosiah through his own book, is intensely interested in political and economic and social equity. He, in fact, develops a model to analyze societies. And a lot of people have this was not recognized early in the Latter-day Saint movement. This was not something that people necessarily pointed to in Joseph Smith's time or in the Brigham Young times. I don't know that this is something that Joseph Smith III pointed to. I don't know, maybe something Fred M. might have noticed, but it was only in more, I think, at least in my experience, in more recent times, that it has been recognized that Mormon has this analytical framework, which at least in the LDS church we have come to call the pride cycle. And that was illustrated here, where you get righteous, the righteousness leads your society to become prosperous. You then become proud because of your prosperousness. Then you become evil. Then your society falls apart and suffers destruction and suffering. Then you are humbled because of the destruction and suffering, and your society, and you repent, and that makes you righteous again. And then that leads to renewed prosperity. And this cycle occurs again and again in Mormon's Book of Mormon. And so this little chart here gives the verses. I didn't have room in the chart to insert the Community of Christ versification, but I include here a link to a fun little table that gives you the conversions. But nonetheless, you can see it is a cycle. Mormon sees this as a recurring cycle throughout the history of his society that he's recording. Now, I, of course, as a modern, member of the LDS Church, had heard about this pride cycle and had found it very interesting. But I thought it was, maybe this is unique to Mormon, it's unique to the Book of Mormon. It's something that Mormons talk about, but maybe this is not something that is really applicable to broader societies. However, I had a friend, an older gentleman who had converted to the church at this time, relatively recently, who I enjoyed talking to about political and economic issues. And he sent me this poem. And when I first got it, I didn't notice the date. So I just read through the poem, and I said to him, "Oh my goodness, you have this wonderful poem that describes the pride cycle." And his response was a bit blank. He didn't know what I was talking about, and explained to me that this was a poem that had been written about the rise and fall of Athenian democracy. And if you'll note the date, which I had not overlooked, this was written in the early 1800s. So this is this kind of cyclical progress and digression of society is something that has been observed by parties other than just of the Prophet Mormon. So question then becomes, how do we apply this analysis to our modern society when our economic conditions are so much different than those of most of human history, and including those of Mormon's time, which was, Mormon lived in a time that was typical of human history. We live in an era which is atypical of human history. But nonetheless, as I thought about his analysis, where he goes, he's saying we need to look at class divisions, we need to look at economic inequality, we need to look at social attitudes towards between class and economic divides. We need to, these are the things that Mormon talks about. This is what he describes as being the cause of this pride cycle, this rise and fall that he saw in the history of the Nephite nation. So I came up with some questions that I asked myself to kind of put a modern take on this analysis of Mormons. So here's a few of questions, just thought questions that I came up with. How do we handle the moral responsibilities of a society that is wealthier than ever before in human history? And that is, as you saw the little chart there, we live in an astonishingly atypical time in human history. We are so much wealthier than any of our ancestors or the societies of any of our ancestors. Another question is, does a welfare state discharge our duties to the poor? And under this one, you could ask questions like, well, one is the welfare state good enough? And of course, there's a lot of people think, at least in the United States, the welfare state is not strong enough. But even in societies that have very strong welfare states, one can ask the question, is that good enough? To, as you know, if you do provide a very generous welfare state like in Western Europe and so forth, is that the end of our duty? We really don't have to do anything for poor people if the government really provides generous support for them, or is there some responsibility to poor people even if the state is providing fairly generous benefits to those who are less advantaged or the poor part of society? Another one I thought of, is what I call the billionaires in blue jeans question. What do you do about divisions in a society that pretends to be classless? So certainly a phenomenon I have noticed in our society is that we have, it used to be in Mormon's time, in the Book of Mormon, it talks about people wearing their wealth. In other words, they talk about fine apparel and jewels and so forth. And indeed, in human history, this was usually how wealth, the class divisions were presented. In other words, wealthy people would wear very fine clothes and jewelry to make, and thus that would publicly display their position and their high status. But in our society, a billionaire will walk down the street dressed in a t-shirt and blue jeans. Now, and he will think that this is, he's not like the fancy people of even a century ago, who dressed in very fine clothes to display their position, their high position in society. Yet on the other hand, we still have intense, large social and economic divisions in our society, but we cover them up because the well-to-do pretend not to be to show traditional displays of class superiority. That's a question. Here's another one, which is, I think, really telling to people like myself who have sort of intense political views sometimes. Can you love a neighbor who supports people who you are sure are going to bring down our democracy? And I know that this applies to both sides of the political spectrum. And we'll get to this point. I have some more material in just a second to elaborate on this particular issue. The last one I think is another one that is telling. I call it the deliverance gangsta question, which is that how do we respond to the negative image of poor people in our society? So I call it the deliverance gangsta question. Actually, there are folks on this call who probably remember the movie Deliverance from 1970. What was it? 2, I believe. It's basically a movie about starring Burt Reynolds, about some wealthy big city people who go out on a raft trip in the countryside, and they're attacked by the hillbillies, and the hillbillies are portrayed as being incestuous, inbred, unintelligent. Really, it paints a very demeaning picture of poor white people in the poor Appalachian white people. And the flip, but another aspect of this is what I call the gangsta. What is our image of poor African Americans or African Americans who live in less well-to-do circumstances? Do we portray them as is the case for most poor whites, as people who struggle to keep their families together and survive economically? Or does our society portray them with stereotypes? Inbred, ignorant people like the poor whites, as they're portrayed in the movie Deliverance, or violent drug dealers as in the gangsta movies. So and the point here is that it's the elites of society who make movies. So what do we say about the elites of society who portray poor people of all races like this? So those are just some thought questions for everyone. So we then come to the end of the book of 4 Nephi. And of course, the book of 4 Nephi is, it's a short book, and it is, at first glance to a reader of the Book of Mormon, it can appear to be very peculiar, because, what's the point of this short little book? Kind of seems almost tacked on to the end. And yet, if one reads it, it is, in fact, a brilliant, brief summation of Mormon's analysis, this pride cycle analysis, which he has employed throughout his book. And it becomes kind of the summation of his analysis. And it starts, of course, the beginning, the first half. And if you actually track through, this is kind of very evenly divided. At the beginning, he describes the arrival of the Zion Society and the characteristics of the Zion Society, and then and then he gets to the middle of the cycle, and he says here that there was, but he kept it. This is the prosperity and the peace. There was still peace in the land, but there was a small part of the people who had revolted from the church and taken the name of Lamanites, and therefore there began to be Lamanites again in the land. And this is interesting, of course, for people who talk about race in the Book of Mormon. It makes it, I think, pretty clear here that certainly by this point, and probably by long before this point, the term Lamanites was no longer a racial or ethnic designation, but rather it was an ideological and political designation. And it came to pass that 200 years had passed away, and the generations had passed away, save it were a few. And now I, Mormon, would know that the people had spread on all the face of the land. They'd become exceedingly rich because of their prosperity in Christ. So we talk about the prosperity gospel. Mormon is addressing the issue of people who focus on how Christ is going to make them prosperous. And now in the 201st year, there began to be among those who were lifted up in pride, such as the wearing of costly apparel and pearls and the fine things of the world. And of course, like I had just said before, in traditional human society, throughout all of history, this was how class divisions were displayed by you wore your class status to display it to other people. And then comes the real turning point. From that time forth, they did not have their substance any longer in common. And they began to gain, and the cycle ratchets back down. But, of course, as Mormon notes, by this point, there's no turning back, because this is the time that now leads up to, there was a great division among the people. It began to break down into traditional ethnic groups, and they began to, and eventually even the Nephites, who were the people who had originally tried to hold on to a bit of the Christian society, they became just as proud. So by Mormon's time, they had become as proud and evil as those who had designated themselves as Lamanites. And this is, of course, the society in which Mormon grew up, and which Mormon is responding to in preparing this abridgment of the history of his nation. And it is, as these are the words of Christ, that a warning to our times, for we are the Gentiles that they're referring of, to turn from our wicked ways, our lyings and deceivings, our secret dominations, murders, and so forth, and strife and wickedness and envyings, that Mormon is focused on warning us about. So let's take it back to today. These are some charts based on research by the Pew organization. And this is the chart on the left is views of Republicans, Democrats about members of the other party. So if you look at the chart on your left, the brownish colors are warm and the bluish colors are cold. And you can see that in our society, among both Democrats and Republicans, the perception of people in the other party is overwhelmingly very cold. And this is further reflected in this chart on the right, which shows how many people have friends in the other political party. And again, you can see that among both Republicans and Democrats, the large majority of their friends and people they know are from their own political party, and there are very few people that they are close to who come from the other political party. So this is, I think, an interesting illustration of one aspect of our society in which we clearly have divisions and we clearly have strifes and envyings and lyings and so forth, and all the other things that Mormon was describing. And then, of course, Mormon is very keen to include Jesus's own prophecy about this last turn of the cycle, which he illustrates in 4 Nephi. And, who says that, basically their generations after the 4th generation, that the righteousness will fall away. And then this is the prophecy that Mormon illustrates in 4 Nephi. So Mormon describes in his own society as one that rejected the Zion that existed among preceding generations. So we asked this question: can we avoid divisions by learning from our elders? So I can have this quote here, which was reprised the quote from the LDS Church First Presidency, who are all very much of a prior generation compared to most of us, even most of us on this call, and who asked us to please strive to live the gospel in our own life by demonstrating Christ-like love and civility in political discourse, which I'm going to use as one illustration of a way in which our society is very much broken down. And of course, we have this great quote from Joseph Smith from 1844. This is near the end of his life. And he says, in reality and essence, we do not differ so far in our religious views, but that we could all drink into one principle of love. One of the grand fundamental principles of Mormonism is to receive truth, come from whence it may. And I think that this is a principle that if we really applied it in our lives, it would help us to come to maybe a more open and tolerant view of other people and the truths that they have and that they're willing to share with us. So let's see. I'm okay. I'm at the end here. So I would like to end with an illustration of what I'm talking about, and an illustration, a positive illustration, to make the argument that this kind of tolerance and openness and patience and civility is possible in our society. Now, of course, I'm recognizing that Mormon's analysis goes way beyond these kinds of divisions. He's talking about class structure and economic inequality and just all the big issues of human society. But, in the interest of time, I'm kind of focusing on this one particular principle of, can't we all get along? So I'd like to end with a little story. So I went to law school at Columbia University, and I had a professor there who I took civil procedure from. Now, civil procedure, some of you may know, is basically all the rules that govern litigation, courts and proceedings, and what papers you file and where you have to file them, and what papers can be filed and what can be admitted and not admitted, and so forth in the court. It's a very dry, boring subject. Even people who are litigators don't like procedure. I mean, they like making the grand arguments in their briefs and so forth, but procedure is just a bunch of rules of the road about how to run a court. And it was, at the time, I was required two things. One, I had already decided I was not going to go into litigation. And secondly, this was 2 terms. You had to take 2 terms of this stuff. Oh, so I signed up for the class because it was a required class. And I had this professor. Now, this professor was a litigator, but had been involved in some pretty high-profile litigation. So she was one of those professors who would illustrate the principles of civil procedure, which was extraordinarily dry, with fun anecdotes from all the cases that she'd been involved in. And she was very clear and precise and oddly humorous in her presentation. And, everybody, loved her class. She was a great teacher because, boy, some legal subjects, it's pretty easy to make entertaining. Torts or criminal law or something like that, you can make that pretty entertaining. But to be able to make civil procedure entertaining was a real triumph. So this professor of mine went on to do some other things, and you may have heard of her. Her name was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And at the time of this, that I did this presentation in 2020, she had just passed away. And so it was well known, in fact, this is, that her intellectual opposite on the court was Antonin Scalia. And I mean, they were seriously intellectual opposites. They had completely divergent and opposed philosophies of how to be judges, how to interpret the Constitution, how to interpret the laws, and so forth. And yet, they were famously great friends. Sorry. It's 4 years ago, and I shouldn't be broken up about this. But they're famously great friends. So what I'd like to do is end here with, and now this is the real trick, to see if I can switch over here and give you a little sample of Nino Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, good friends. Okay. All right. Let's see if, all right. You know what, Robert, did you get my email?
I did, and I believe I have it ready to share.
Why don't you go ahead and you run it, because I know that I'm gonna take minutes and minutes and minutes, so I got to switch over to this YouTube.
Okay, it looks like it's fairly long, and I'll start from the beginning, right?
Well, it's the cue I gave you takes us to really just about a minute, an hour and 13 minutes into the presentation. Does it show that?
Let me see. No, I got the whole thing. So an hour and 13 minutes. So let me see what I can do. If you would stop sharing.
Okay.
Okay.
Report is funded by a grant from the
rush through.
I don't understand what he means by the last part. Well, a proactive stand-up.
Okay. Yeah, go to a minute, an hour and 13 minutes.
That'll come up in 15 seconds.
Okay.
She could not be a police officer. She could not be a firefighter. She could not be a coal miner. She could not work at night. There were all these restrictions. There were very women lawyers, maybe 3% of the bar. And
they're talking about
judges.
many of the cases that they've
So I
dealt
never
with.
aspired to be a lawyer, certainly not a judge, because if I had to make a living, I better be a teacher. That was a secure job for women. And the exhilarating thing for me when I think of my daughter and my granddaughters is the opportunities open to them that didn't exist. I'll give you my favorite example of this is my granddaughter, who's now 23, when she was 8, was with me and I was being interviewed, and she said, well, I wanted to be part of this show too. So the reporter said, all right, Clara, what would you like to be when you grow up? And Clara's response was, I would like to be president of the United States of the world. And that, to me, the change in what girls can aspire to do and can achieve has been just exhilarating.
Well, unfortunately, you come to the end of the line. I just want to share with you the essence of a conversation that was repeated over and over again with me and the producers of this program, especially the executive producer, Mike Friedman, who you have met. And that is the thought that we live at a time in Washington when the idea that two people who have strongly different opinions on very important issues can actually be good friends and can actually respect one another. And that kind of mutual respect is so terribly important today. And I truly hope that this program, televised as it's been, can set an example and serve as a model for people all over the country who might have different opinions, but do recognize that in this country there's plenty of room for the different opinions, and we ought to have more room for mutual friendship. So thank you both so very much for being here.
Robert, can you hear me?
Yes.
That was at a minute and 13 minutes, an hour and 13 minutes.
Yeah, that started at an hour and 13 minutes, actually, 15 seconds before that.
Okay.
That was not it?
No, well, that was the end of the presentation, but they have a particular question. And I cannot get out of my presentation now. Oh, here we go. Okay, so here they are.
You want me to stop share?
Yeah, let me give it a try.
Okay, it's yours.
All right. Sorry, folks. I'm going to try to make this happen. Okay, bear with me. Okay, just let's get past the advertisement.
When I played the queued up one, it was a minute and an hour.
Oh, I'm sorry, I did you wrong. Can everyone see this?
No.
Okay.
I can put mine back up and go to an hour and 3 minutes.
Yeah, go to an hour and 3 minutes. That's the one I was trying to. I gave you the wrong information.
Okay, let's do this again.
Understand what he means by the last part. Well, proactive. limit provision.
Respond. I
And imagine that you can limit some things that can be spoken.
Okay, yeah, go on from here.
Not limit things that can be printed. I think it's the same criteria as to whether the limitation is unconstitutional.
I think David must have a case in mind.
A question here from Nikki Schnapp of U.S. News and World Report.
Oops, did you lose the sound?
Robert, we lost sound.
Robert, we lost the sound. You're on mute also, Robert.
I had a footnote that referred to the University of Virginia
Did
at
it come back?
Charlottesville.
Yeah, you could just scroll back a minute.
Well, you have to forgive this ignorant person because she doesn't know that there is
Okay,
no University
I
of
think
Virginia
I know
at
what's going
Charlottesville.
on,
There
so
is
hang on a
only
second.
University
Okay.
of Virginia.
And she even talked about the campus of the University of Virginia. My goodness.
But you know what he did do? He wasn't finished writing the dissent. It was getting rather late. We're into June already. He gave me what was the
Can you hear it
penultimate
now?
copy of
Yes.
his dissent. He wasn't ready to circulate it yet, but he came to my chambers and gave it to me and said, I want to give you as much time as I can to answer this. So I went off to my Circuit Judicial Conference, read the thing on the plane, and it ruined my whole weekend. But that he gave me the extra days to respond. I really appreciated that.
I have never gotten angry at Ruth or at any of my colleagues because of the way they voted in an opinion. I mean, if you cannot disagree with your colleagues on the law without taking it personally, you ought to get another day job. I mean, it's just not the kind of a job that will allow you to behave that way. So Ruth and I disagree on the law all the time. It's never had anything to do with our friendship.
And we do also have a difference in style. I'd say people might regard my opinions as rather dull, boring. Yours are really jazzy sometimes.
Here's a question from Seth Dawson
Okay.
of the Office of Congressman.
We can end here. Okay.
I think that's my cue to step in here with my first
Right.
question. Thank you, James, for the beautiful presentation of things about Zion that most of us, I think, don't really associate that clearly with the Book of Mormon. I went back into the earlier part of the Book of Mormon, and you didn't mention anything about 30 years. This would be 30 years after the catastrophe of 3 days of darkness. But 30 years, the people had begun to separate, and as I read it, they separated into tribes. They identified themselves as tribes again, and then before too long, they were back in the ites. I'm curious at what possible association you would make between their association into tribes and the political parties and even our religious denominations.
I think they're very comparable. I mean, we know that these 7 tribes of the Lehite nations existed from the very beginning. So apparently, they seem to persist in some shape or form throughout the entire 1,000 years. But I think the fact that we find that our political divisions and our religious divisions, they do tend to follow family heritage. I mean, obviously, as people change religions and people change political parties, but there is, a tendency for people to follow the political beliefs of their parents. So these are deeply ingrained in both. Obviously, they were deeply ingrained in the Lehite society, and they're deeply ingrained in our own society. And so it takes, a conscious effort to overcome those and to kind of reach across the borders, so to speak, and associate with somebody who's not in your tribe. Because human beings are tribal. We are all tribal. Every society, in all of history, including right up through today, we're very tribal people, and so it takes a conscious effort to step outside of our tribe. And that would be.
But we are attempting here to reach hands across those tribal boundaries a bit, and so thank you for that clarification. Let me highlight people that Reactions has place to raise your hand, and Val and Monty already have their hands up, and Deb commonly keeps the queue in line. If you can't find that Reactions point, then wave your hand and she commonly picks you up and fits you in the queue where you belong. All right, Deb, it's up to you.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Val, go ahead, and then Monty.
Hi, James. Interesting, really interesting presentation. My first question is, do you see any connection between our current prosperity, unprecedented prosperity, and the pride cycle? In other words, did the pride cycle produce the prosperity? Because if it did, it would presumably mean we had unparalleled righteousness that produced unparalleled prosperity. And I'm guessing you don't actually think that, or am I wrong?
No, I think that it's, the Book of Mormon is, as I understand it, directed to our times. And it's directed to the issues of our times. Mormon was guided. He was looking at the history of his own people, but he was guided in his editorial selections, to focus on lessons that were important for our times. And I think, so I'd look at the lessons for our times in kind of reverse order. Whether or not righteousness produced our prosperity, it has certainly produced a lot of pride. And that is, I think, one could argue from the Book of Mormon that is kind of the overwhelming issue of our times. We are proud. We look back on our predecessors and reject what they did and taught, and everything in human history. This idea of the modern, the modern is a modern idea. This idea that modern things are better than what came before is not something that you normally would have found in human history. So, and our pride at being moderns, I would say, is the pride that the Book of Mormon is warning us against. And of course, a lot of our pride on being modern people is based on our prosperity and our scientific and advance and so forth. So I don't know if that.
Okay, so
that's how I look at it.
I mean, I think that a counter argument could be made on whether Mormon, most of his writing, was meant for us or for his own time initially when he was drafting it. And we talked about that a little bit, maybe, I don't know if you remember. But the follow-on question is, what is the relative weight that you put on equality versus prosperity? So you could have people, an example of this is in Britain, they're kind of exercised at the moment because they have fallen behind Mississippi in terms of average wealth, and they have higher levels of equity in Britain and in Europe in general, but their level of wealth is much lower. And there seems to be a relationship between wealth and like the striving for equity often leads to a reduction of wealth. So that having a certain level of wealth means everybody has certain necessities. Like the poor in the United States are actually wealthy by world standards.
And historical standards.
Yeah, well, yeah, by historical standards, but even by contemporary world standards, they tend to be wealthy. But the more and what the United States versus Europe tends to demonstrate is you get higher levels of wealth if you tolerate a certain amount of inequality. That the inequality actually tends to produce wealth, and one of the reasons for that is that in the Soviet Union, nobody owned the capital. So there was nobody overseeing the efficient use of capital, and the consequence was they were value subtractors. The things that they put into the oil and the metals that they put in to produce a tractor or whatever the output was worth less than what they put into it because they didn't make good use of capital. So someone like Elon Musk makes really good use of capital. And anyway, the question I'm trying to pose here is, should we one can be envious of the wealthy, and that is kind of a sin, and a lot of politics I think is kind of envy. And if we have trade-offs between equality and just the general level of wealth, what does the Book of Mormon does the Book of Mormon tell us anything about that? Does it say if the equality matters more than the well-being of people having food and clothing and shelter and all that, or does the well-being matter more?
Well, this was the point I was trying to make by showing that chart of wealth over human history. The huge amounts of wealth in our times is atypical of human history. And I see the Book of Mormon as being more general. All right, so I said just before that I think it was written for our times, and I think there's an element to that, but it's also kind of written to address the entire human condition. And over most of history, the human condition was one of relatively low wealth across the society, but wealth that was still unequally divided. So this is part of the struggle that I think, and I think the questions, so my view would be that the questions Mormon is asking isn't this issue of how much inequality do you tolerate for modern capitalistic prosperity. I think that's not an issue that the Book of Mormon addresses. It's like saying, does the Book of Mormon tell us what the proper marginal tax rates should be? I do not think the Book of Mormon has anything to say about what the proper marginal tax rate should be. And so but what it does tell us is, you have to have a society which minimally takes care of the poor, and you have to have a society which does not have class divisions. So the question is, can you have capitalistic wealth without having pride and social divisions that make people feel ashamed and poor? That was the point of the deliverance gangsta thing, which is to say that even in a prosperous society, we have social divisions, and we have class divisions that look down on the poor people. And I think that's the kind of thing, that's the issue the Book of Mormon is addressing. Okay. Not what is the proper marginal tax rates, or what is the proper extent of the welfare state, which are modern issues that I don't think Mormon really addresses.
Okay, just one last quick comment, and that is, I do think that in an agrarian society like the traditional societies for every place, that the connections between social solidarity and prosperity and social division and abject poverty is really, it's all tied up. Everybody's living on the margins. They don't have a lot of room for error, and their social solidarity creates peace, and that creates the prosperity. I think that capitalism is breaking those linkages. The internal logic of the pride cycle in the Book of Mormon is where wealth is connected to good behavior isn't as intrinsic to the logic of modern capitalism. Capitalism is a new thing, I think, and it creates different kinds of dynamics than what was being described in the Book of Mormon.
But my response to that would be that may be, you might make that argument looking at a fairly narrow piece of the modern world, basically the first world. But in the second and third worlds, this kind of thing still it dominates. Like take Brazil or India or most of Africa or the Middle East, and I'm now naming where most of humanity lives. There, the social divisions are so extreme that one can argue that they are interfering with the social solidarity that would produce prosperity. So I think even in our modern world, one can see phenomena where class division does impact on the society's prosperity.
Val, were you finished? Okay, thank you. Monty, you're next, and then Paul.
Okay, I'm having trouble talking tonight, so everybody bear with me. I think part of the problem with one of the things you mentioned there, where people tend to become tribal, it's easy to talk about, changing that, but when it comes right down to it, it's a part of what makes a human being up to now. We tend to gravitate towards those people who support our point of view and who make us feel like we've got a handle on things, because so many of us feel lost and we're wondering about whether we really know what's happening or not. And if somebody says, well, I think you've got a great opinion, or you hear somebody that you really agree with, you naturally tend to spend more time with them than you would somebody who has a totally different point of view. But it just it's sad that a lot of what you were talking about is based on economic equality instead of I see wealth as something that encompasses your ability to make an impact on the world around you. In other words, your little world, and let the Lord take care of the larger picture. If I'm certain that I'm being kind and caring and am trying to uplift other people instead of tear them down, no matter what their point of view is, because it's not my job to judge their stuff. I only am in charge of trying to follow my moral code and try to keep me doing what I believe the Lord has set aside for me to try to accomplish. And I'm kind of rambling here, guys. Sorry. But I really feel that a lot of it has to do with our whole perception of what constitutes wealth and richness of as far as our daily lives are concerned. We look out at places like deep poverty. Paul was talking, somebody was talking about children looking after each other and things like this in a poor culture. Well, I'm sure their hearts are just as warmed by the caring and love they get from the people around them as it is around the people around us that have lots of money that we can make off of them and stuff like that. I mean, it just, to me, it seems like our value system is so skewed towards economic that we have trouble defining in our own hearts what real wealth is. Sorry, I'm done now.
Okay, thanks, Monty.
Thank you,
Jonathan
Marty.
has shared with us in the chat from the book of Alma. And the people of Nephi began to prosper again in the land and began to multiply and to wax exceedingly strong again in the land. And they began to grow exceedingly rich. But notwithstanding their riches or their strength or their prosperity, they were not lifted up in the pride of their eyes, neither were they slow to remember the Lord their God, but they did humble themselves exceedingly before him. That's from Alma 62, verses 48 through 49. Thank you, Jonathan.
So there's hope in the Book of Mormon too.
Paul, go ahead, please.
Fundamental question, James, is which type of government is going to work best for Zion? We have, according to what I've been hearing, the happiest countries are the Nordic countries, where people are generally prosperous and there's not very much poverty, and they do a very good job of educating their kids. But in your presentation, you highlighted capitalism, but then you also highlighted Marx's communist approach, and we began with a statement that people had all things in common. So I'm curious, after all this, just what do you think is the appropriate economic situation and governance for Zion?
Well, I suspect that it will be a variety of approaches dependent on the nature of the society and the evolution of the society. For example, the Nordic countries are a very odd case because they actually are very capitalistic. In other words, the level of industry that is privately owned in the Nordic countries is really quite high. It's much higher than in other parts of Europe or in the United States. But they tax themselves very heavily in order to support their welfare state. So what is the piece of the formula that's important? Is it having a very high level of private ownership and private management of industry? Or is it that they use the state to pass around the money? Another aspect of the Nordic countries, which people, is starting to become an issue in those countries, and which we kind of don't like to talk about, but they are very ethnically uniform. So there's social solidarity there based on ethnicity. And so, it's pretty easy to say, oh, I'm going to pay high taxes to pay for a good education and good health care for my neighbor's kids because they're blonde and blue-eyed like me. But when it's, and they're descended from the Vikings like I am. So, I don't mind paying lots of taxes to help take care of those kids. But as we see in these societies, when you start to introduce other ethnic groups, the social solidarity is tested. So the Nordic countries, I admire them. I've got a lot of Swedish ancestry, so I'm always happy to tout the Nordic countries. But it's a complicated situation, and I think it's a system that is perhaps not readily duplicated other places. So the question of what kind of government is the appropriate one for Zion, I think it has to evolve out of each society, and it has to evolve out of the society's their way of manifesting. In the end, it's only going to evolve when the people want it to evolve, and when people's kind of hearts are changed and so forth. And it's going to express itself in different ways, I think, in different cultures and among different sorts of peoples. And maybe they'll look to the Nordic countries as an example, and maybe they'll look elsewhere for an example. Maybe if the country is very large, they'll have to look to more ethnically diverse and politically diverse countries like the United States for a model. But as I say, it's I think maybe I often wonder that we tend to look at it in reverse. We say, let's get good government and then we'll have good people. But I think it's really the opposite. What the Book of Mormon is telling us is that you need to get some good people, you need to get some righteousness amongst the people, and then the good government will follow. I think one can make that argument that's how you need to look at it.
Thank you.
Okay. Jonathan, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Okay, yeah, it's been a great discussion. I think I've mentioned before that I've been teaching for a Chinese university for the last 4 years. And this issue comes up a lot with my students. And one of the things they can't understand is why Americans have the system that we do. Because from their perspective, our society is very violent and dangerous and so on. And when we lived in China, you could walk through any of the major cities any time of night and never have any problems. You didn't have people coming up and begging. You didn't have the risk of gunshots or being robbed or anything like that. So, their system has a lot of merit. And they asked me why we have such different systems. And I always go back to the book Guns, Germs, and Steel. Some of you may be familiar with that, where they explain that in European countries, agriculture started off sort of on an individual basis. Anybody could go out and clear land, grow wheat or corn or whatever, potatoes. Whereas in China, their whole culture is based on rice. And the only way you can grow rice is if the entire community works together to build the canals and the terraces, and it's just a community effort. So as a result of that, their whole far beyond or before communism ever came along, their whole approach to society was, work together, we're all in it together, we help one another. And we see that in our students. They tend to help each other to the point of cheating on all their tests all the time. and they don't believe in copyright law because they figure, well, if something sounds good, why can't we all share it? That's kind of the mentality. And so, whereas our system and the way we've grown up is more of a European model where we value individual rights and individual freedoms almost at the expense of society in many cases. So, as to what kind of a society would work for Zion, it's very difficult to figure out because there's elements of all these different systems that are good and others that aren't good. And so I think the principles that, we have in the Restoration would apply to every society, but how it gets implemented is a really interesting question, Paul. But I also wanted to say that sometimes I know the American media tends to portray China as this threat and dangerous and horrible and repressive and all that stuff. When you live there, their press presents the United States that way. And I think it's more a function of media trying to generate views and contention and clicks and so on than it is reality, because actually life in China was pretty good. We really enjoyed it there. The people felt happy and prosperous, and the Chinese government has lifted 700 million people out of poverty in the last 20 or 30 years, which is just incredible. And you just don't see the kind of poverty there that we see here in the United States, as well as the drug problems and so on. So that's a longer discussion. I just wanted to throw that in there as something to consider in response to Paul's excellent question.
Well, thank you for that, Jonathan. I'm delighted to hear that, and my own experience with the Chinese people supports what you're saying. My primary experience has been with the Polynesians, and there's so much we have to learn from them for their generosity. They're a little bit like the Chinese. The people of the clan got on the canoe and they went to another island and established themselves. and that clan, that cluster of people were interdependent. When the Tahitians went to Hawaii, they established the clan having all the territory between two rivers, so that from the mountain peaks where the alpine resources were, down to the slopes of the mountains where the hardwood trees were, down to the gradual slopes where the taro and coconuts, and the fish traps, and then out to sea. You have specialist people living in each of those areas, gathering the resources and making them available for the rest of the clan. And they did so. They lived in harmony for 1,000 years that way. Now, of course, we build walls across those territories, given private ownership, and fix it so much more civilized.
Yeah, and, you know, related to that is the issue of population density too, because China has about the same amount of inherent or livable land as the United States does, but it has 4 times the population. So you can imagine what the United States would look like in every community if we had 4 times as many people as we do now. You know, my town here would have 8,000 people. Which, but you know, for our little town, that would be a big deal. We'd have to get more than one stoplight. But you know, seriously, in a city like New York, you know, if you had 4 times the population, it would be like Shanghai. Could the New York City government, the way the system is now, handle that? I think that'd be impossible. So there's a lot of factors that go into this besides just political philosophy.
Floor's open, ladies and gentlemen. Here's a chance for questions and comments.
I'll add one little thing, I guess I should say, and that is that I think what Jim brought up about prosperity and that chart, I'm actually using that chart in a book I'm doing right now, or one similar to it. But there is a level of righteousness really that accompanies economic prosperity, because in terms of generosity, for example, you know, capitalism does generate a lot of wealth, but the only reason a person becomes wealthy under capitalism is if they're benefiting large numbers of people. That's why the software people have accumulated so much wealth, because the software they produce has lifted billions of people around the world out of poverty. You know, everywhere we go in the world, people have cell phones and they have access to the internet and so on. And that's because of the inventiveness and the business acumen and so on of these people who became wealthy because of that. But you can think of it as everybody paying a few dollars to have the internet. When you multiply that by several billion people, it makes the people who originated the internet wealthy. But everybody is benefiting from that. In fact, poor people benefit more than the rich people from the technology. So in that sense, I think it's you can look at that as a righteous principle of blessing the world with your talents. That's one way I look at it anyway.
Thanks, Jonathan. Val, go ahead, please.
Before I go to my question, just a second what Jonathan said. The cell phone has revolutionized the lives of poor farmers in Africa, because they used to have to go to central markets used to have to use wholesalers and other intermediaries to sell their products. And once they got the cell phone, they could get the market prices themselves, and it freed them from people who were essentially exploiting them by being middlemen between them and their customers. My question though is for James. I wonder if Zion is well, start with the Book of Mormon. Before the establishment of the Zion that's described there, and there was the destruction of wicked people. So I'm wondering if maybe there was a sort of cleansing of the wicked that made possible a kind of peace among the people that wouldn't otherwise have been possible. I know in Utah, the Zion attempts pretty much failed. A lot of attempts were made in the 19th century. And so one question would be, is is it a precondition for Zion that you sort of eliminate certain kinds of wickedness among the people and the wicked people? And then the second thing is it possible that when we were asking about the governance of Zion, I think the ultimate king in for governance is Christ. And it may be that we won't ever have a true Zion community until we have Christ as king, and it'll be a kingdom. And then the third thing you might maybe you could comment on, I wonder how accurately descriptive Mormon's account of that period is. Like he was saying, there are no strifes, contentions. Like, did children not fight amongst themselves in that period? You know, what is the level of description? Is there, I think it's possible that there's a certain idealization of Mormon looking back on that period, and the granularity is not very great. So anyway, can we have Zion without Christ as king? Isn't that the ultimate governance of Zion? And is there some idealization going on in the Book of Mormon? And can we have Zion with the normal mix of good and evil people? Those are the three questions I'd pose.
So that's one of the reasons I included in my discussion the fact these kind of often overlooked verses in 3rd Nephi, which describe how after Christ's visit, the people still had to go out and preach, and there was still a lot of resistance to the Christian message, and there was actually active persecution. And it was only by actively preaching that they brought around enough of the people in society to have this Zion type society that Mormon describes. And I think that's very important. So the thought occurs to me in response to your question is that it may be that it's not the destruction of the evil people, because according to 3rd Nephi, the people who were opposed, there were still plenty of people around who were resistant to the Christian message. And they were only converted through a lot of preaching and diligent effort. So it would strike me that maybe the difference wasn't that we got rid of the bad people, but that the good people got better. In other words, you had this group of people hugely inspired by the visitation of Christ, who became far more zealous and far more active in their proselyting and their righteous living than they had been before. And that was what converted the rest of the people in their society. So, I think about it, this could be a challenge to us, that the difference isn't overthrowing the bad parts of society, is building up the good parts of society and making the good parts of society stronger and more vocal and more proactive in presenting the good message. So, as far as the government of the kingdom of God, this is kind of what Warner and I addressed in our Working Towards Zion book. We were very deliberate about the title. It was not Zion, it was Working Toward Zion. It wasn't the United Order, it was Principles of the United Order for the Modern World. I suspect that a true whole all the way wholehearted Zion society may not be possible without Christ as king. But that doesn't mean that we can't study and build toward a Zion society. So, our view in that book and my view has always been that I don't know that I or anybody else or any group of people without Christ as king can create a Zion society, but that doesn't mean that we can't work toward it and apply the principles of the Zion society, and those can't have an impact like at the time after Christ's visit to the Americas. It appears that it was the diligent teaching and example of the righteous people that brought around this idyllic society because the anti-righteous people apparently were still around. So I would say this is a striving kind of a message rather than this is how you get to the end result type of message. And as to your last point, was Mormon idealizing things? I think we I've got no problem with recognizing that Mormon has an agenda. He's a man, he says very openly that he has an agenda in preparing this book to convince people that Jesus is the Christ and so forth. And I think he has this broader agenda of trying to warn the peoples that receive the book of the terrible fate of his own people and what led to the terrible fate of his own people. So yeah, no, I'm quite sure that Mormon tailored his history to fit his agenda, but that's okay. It is what it is. All authors do that, so I don't particularly critique Mormon for doing it because it's just what it's what any author who's got a point, a theory, or some that he's advocating is always going to tailor his work to what he's trying to convey.
Yeah, that's true for all historians for sure. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, Monty, and then Paul. Go ahead, Monty.
Okay, once again, please bear with me. Well, you brought up a subject a while ago, very briefly, how most of the people in the world nowadays are getting cell phones, and a lot of people are making money from the fact that they have access to a cell phone and can do business that way. And it's becoming such an ingrained part. I mean, it's like it's attached to our hands anymore. I mean, we've grown so dependent upon this one thing that, I mean, it's literally easy to learn in 1,000 new languages. Oh, heck, no bars. And I really feel that the big problem with the philosophy of the rapture is that there's only going to be about a tiny trickle of humanity going up there, because as soon as they find out they can't take their cell phone with them, they're just not going to be interested anymore.
Good job, Monty.
Very, very, very perceptive.
Thank you.
Thanks, Monty. Okay, Paul, go ahead.
Thank you, Monty. You do a good job of helping us laugh just about every week. Thank you. Well, I have been challenged because I like this concept of Zion so much. I use it a lot, but I've been challenged to recognize that the Zion concept does not communicate well around the world, particularly in the conflict between Palestinians and the Israelis. I read the Doctrine and Covenants and I see numerous references to the cause of Zion, and therefore I have come to think that perhaps Zion is not quite the same thing as the cause of Zion. I wonder what you think about that.
Well, I'd have to kind of look at the specific language that you're using, because I think at least in our LDS tradition, I don't think we use the phrase "the cause of Zion." Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but that may be more of a Community of Christ phrase. I may not be qualified to speak to the distinction. I would, however, note, I mean, you bring up a really pertinent and important example of ethnic division, which is very much what the Book of Mormon is talking about when you mention the Israeli-Palestinian matter, and that's like hugely relevant. And I think the I mean, the message of the Book of Mormon is kind of pessimistic. It's saying if you don't get over the your ethnic divisions, you'll destroy yourselves, and that's more of a cautionary message than a message of hope or this is how you do it. But I think it underlies the importance of finding ways to bridge the divides. And when you talk about, the idea of Zion being difficult to communicate around the world, I think that there is a great human commonality on this message of Zion. If you go I think, and maybe Jonathan can speak to this, who's been a world traveler all his life, but my impression is that you could go anywhere in the world, including to Palestine and Israel. And if you explain to them these basic concepts the way that Mormon explains them, rich people should not look down on poor people. People should take care of the poor people. People should not hate each other. People should try to get along and bridge the divides. People shouldn't kill each other over issues. I think that you would, we probably elaborate them out some. I think that you would find a very broad acceptance of those issues all across humanity. So I think that Zion, this concept of Zion of a friendly, happy society which has social solidarity and peace and so forth, I think that has a very broad resonance if we look at it that way. And that's really what I think kind of Mormon is trying to get across in this thing. He's saying this is the society that we all want, and these are the things that send us off course. And he's doing this using his national history. He's doing this analysis of how you get there and what throws you off course from getting there. So that's kind of how I see Mormon's book. What the point of one of the points and messages of Mormon's book.
I've been intrigued by the comparative effort, or the modern effort toward compassionate communities. And I like that because it strikes me as being a building block toward Zion.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's going to, and this was kind of the point that Warner and I tried to get at in the second half of our book, Working Towards Zion. We really tried to, and Warner updated it in that Radiant Mormonism book that I pointed to. We really tried to go across the board and really look at lots of different examples from lots of different societies. We were not just talking about LDS people and what LDS people were doing. I mean, one of our prime examples about how to maybe achieve a more prosperous and equitable economic situation was to look to the examples of the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain, which are a big industrial complex, very successful companies from a purely capitalistic point of view that are employee owned. And they were founded by a Spanish Catholic priest. And so we point to that as being, one of the leading examples of how you could apply Zion type principles in a very modern European capitalistic environment. So I think, we probably, the answer is probably going to be, 50 different sources that be melded in different ways to produce a Zion society.
I would like to come back at the distinction. It seems to me that section 6 that we have in the Doctrine and Covenants is mutually shared. And
Yeah.
section 6 is one that specifies the cause of Zion.
Really? Okay.
Sure, there are several others, but that's one that immediately comes to mind, and I'm confident that that I can find others, but that's first one that comes up.
I typed that one in the chat, guys,
Oh,
from
thank
the LDS Doctrine and Covenants.
Okay, thank you. And great. I mean, I love the phrase, so maybe we can start to spread it in LDS circles.
Well, the concept of the cause
You're right.
is somewhat different, I think, from the object. And therefore, I think we maybe need to look at the processing as a separate stage from the end result.
Oh, yes. And as I said, this was the whole point of our Working Towards Zion book, was that you're not going to just make a jump and suddenly be in a perfect society and a perfect economy. It's something that's gradual and has to be worked toward. And this would be your cause of Zion concept. Yeah.
Okay, Val, go ahead.
So I was talking with a Chinese student who was over here, and he mentioned how astonished he was that the UPS drivers would come and leave things on the porches of places. Now, Jonathan, you can correct me if you didn't find this to be the truth in your experience in China, but he said that was sort of unthinkable in China because people would take the package. And there's a distinction in the prosperity of Northern Europe and Southern Europe that I think bears on this idea of righteousness and how it creates prosperity. In Northern Europe, there's a much higher levels of trust among strangers. So it makes it possible for economic activity to happen between strangers. And it's sort of the divide between Protestant Europe and Catholic Europe, that in China too, my understanding is they have high levels of trust within the family. So you tend to have family companies, but lower, not as high of levels of trust between strangers as would be typical within our culture. So the combination of individualism and high trust is conducive to prosperity. One other thing that is conducive to prosperity, may strike you as a little odd, but some people describe the concept of God as having huge economic impact because it internalizes ethics. That somebody's watching you all the time, and so you behave righteously because you feel like you're going to be judged even if you're by yourself. And that actually lowers transaction costs a lot and produces wealth gains because people don't steal even when they could get away with it because God's watching them, so they don't think they can get away with it. So this idea of trust and honesty, all those kinds of things that are part of righteousness, they have clear and demonstrable economic impacts and are conducive to prosperity.
Neat point. Thank you, Val. That's a good one.
I'm done.
Okay, Jonathan, go ahead.
Okay, just to answer what he said about packages, we used to get packages all the time in China and no one ever stole them. I never thought about that. Maybe we were just lucky, but I know Amazon has started having centralized places because so many packages get stolen here now that you can go to a place and pick them up. So I guess it depends on where you live. But I posted in the chat here a link to this How to Zion blog. And that's one that I started several years ago where I was just posting things because I like to think of Zion as a verb rather than just a noun. And so I call this How to Zion. And I have dozens of examples in here of just developments in the world, not necessarily all involving religion, but people just making the world a better place. And I think it is pretty much a universal value, particularly among younger generations, that they don't have the same attachment to materialism as older generations do, apparently, according to surveys and stuff. They like to travel, they like experiences more than things. More and more, they don't even want to own a car, they just want to rent one when they need it, and so on. So that's all kind of a consciousness, I guess, towards the Zion ideal. So I'm
That's
real
because they can put
optimistic.
all their stuff in their cell phones.
Yeah, they don't buy books, they just buy them on a Kindle, and so on. But they really are all around the world. Kids communicate, they know each other, they have things in common, they all work to help each other. It's really kind of an optimistic, positive thing for the most part. I mean, there's exceptions, of course, but so I like efforts like my little How to Zion blog or different things we can do to accentuate the positive. Let me give you one last example, then I'll quit. Our local newspaper here on the coast, some guy posted an article about how everything's, the environment's terrible. It's all collapsing, we're not careful, the world's going to burn up. As I responded, I wrote a long editorial, which they published, about how, no, we got to be positive for the kids. We got to give them hope for the future. And in reality, the environment is cleaner than it's been in centuries. And we have more productive food sources and all these positive developments that people don't realize or appreciate because the media accentuates the negative. And it got a lot of really good responses because it's rare for a newspaper to publish something positive, right? But I think each of us in our spheres of influence can be positive influences to build Zion. It doesn't have to be some church organization or someone telling us what to do. We just do it naturally with our friends and neighbors, the people around us. And in society, it's all we need to be positive voices, and that all contributes to the cause of Zion. So just some thoughts.
Thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate that. David, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I wanted to comment a little bit on Paul's question about the cause of Zion and Zion. I think if you were a Palestinian, the word Zion is a bad word. But I think Mormons' concept of a utopian community would be very popular. And so I think the point is we need to be careful how we use the word Zion as we're trying to communicate this idea that Mormon is trying to get us to see what a utopian community would look like. Okay? Or to clarify a little more, Zion in Israel is a totally different concept than it is here to us, Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, no,
Thank you, David.
that's certainly words where you always have to be careful about our words.
Okay, Monty, go ahead, please.
Well, I'm trying to remember what it was. Oh yeah, we were talking about deliveries, and people worrying about them being stolen off their porches. We had one package that was stolen out front, and so I made up a sign to put on the door to ask them to knock or ring the doorbell when they make a delivery. And I was thinking of how to word it, and I came up with several iterations, but one of them that I didn't use was delivery drivers, please knock on the door or ring the doorbell. We promise not to shoot you.
In Kansas City.
Yeah.
Oh boy. Our reputation is spread. Thank you, Monty. Let me add one more little comment here, because back in 1978, I got involved in the End of Hunger Project. And at that time, there were several countries with an infant mortality rate over 2,000. And that is over 200, I'm sorry. That is over 200 babies out of every 1,000 born died in the first year after birth. that was taken by the United Nations as a signal of poverty and hunger, because when kids are reasonably well fed, then their infant mortality rate goes down significantly. But today, we are, I think the highest is about 170. So we've made significant gains around the world in terms of the infant mortality rate, and therefore the measure of hunger. At the time that I was involved in 1978, the estimate was 24,000 people a day dying of starvation. And we've got that number down, even though the population is now over 8 billion. And so the fact is that we have been producing almost a ton of food for every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth. And so I wanted to follow up on what Jonathan said. Here's some good news. Our earth is proving to feed its population beyond what we anticipated was the capacity earlier. And while we still are not doing a real good job of distributing to make it so everyone is fed, there are significant improvements that have been made in the last half century that are remarkable, and we should be proud of.
Blair did put in some of the sections in the Doctrine and Covenants that refer to the cause of Zion, if you have a chance and haven't looked at them. They're in the chat. Thank you, Blair.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Blair. Well, we're approaching 10 o'clock, and so it's time for the fat lady to sing, and therefore I'm going to play that role. But the discussion can continue afterwards. Good night, the Lord is watching o'er you. Good night, his blessings go before you. Good night, and we'll be praying for you. So good night, may God bless you. Good night, friends.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you all.
And thank you,
I'll
especially John, especially I want to say thank you to Brother Lucas, because look at the fascinating discussion we've had here until 10 o'clock at night. Such a delightful